Wet on wet. This is when you take your brush with plain water and wet the paper. You want to get it nice and wet, and then add wet paint to the wet paper. That's why they call it wet on wet. So I'm putting my brush in a little blue paint here. I'm going to take a brush full of wet paint, and it's going to blend with the water. If I add a little more water, it gets lighter, kind of like a sky. This is a great way to make a simple wash in the background. But if I add a different color on top, then I can have something called bleeding. So I take a little, that one is just the color sort of fading together. You can see it spreading. But now if I take a really different color, I'm going to take a little black and put it on. You'll start to see the colors softly blend together and they get like a fuzzy little edge. That's called bleeding. It's a great trick to use. All of these techniques are to help you have watercolor tools in your toolbox so that when you're painting, you can experiment and make all sorts of different techniques. This almost looks like mountains. The next technique is called wet on dry. This time, you're going to use wet paint on dry paper. The wet on wet technique made a fuzzy, soft background, but the wet on dry technique will give you a crisp line and the paint won't bleed. This is a really good thing to know when you want your paint to stay where you want it to stay. This is great for like drawing with paint, even filling in an area. One fun trick is that because the paintbrush mine that I just painted is wet, if I add a different color to it, it will bleed, but only in the line. So it's using that same technique from earlier, but it will stay in the line. You can see I tilted my paper a little bit and it runs from one color into another. Great way to make like faded lines. And you can see I'm just adding some light lines and adding another color into those lines. I'm going to add a little black and tilt my paper again, and you can see the paint just spreading and it doesn't go outside of the line. It stays inside. Adding salt to watercolor paint is one of my favorite techniques. So I want to wet my paper and get a good amount of paint on that surface. This has to be a fairly bright color. It doesn't work on super light colors. So I'm putting a little paint and I'm going to actually add a couple of different colors and I'm going to even add a little black just so you can really see the difference. And I'm going to then sprinkle just a touch of salt. It's regular table salt. Even kosher salt works, but you just need a pinch. You can see I just took a tiny little bit, and right now it doesn't look like much. But what you're going to see is that when it dries, it's going to make a really cool texture. Here's one that I did earlier, and when it dried, you can make those little star texture shapes. That's the salt, and you can take and just rub off any salt once it's dry. It's a really fun technique for making really interesting textures in watercolor. Crayon resist is a lot of fun too. So right now I'm drawing some stars with a yellow crayon. I had already added a black outline with a black crayon to make it look like a city just for fun. And I'm adding some yellow windows. It doesn't look like much right now. And if you ever want to add like different colors, crayons are made out of wax and water don't stick together. So this is a really fun technique. And white is really fun too. I'm making white stars. Doesn't look like much right now, but when I put the paint on it, you'll really see it. Just imagine making a zebra. You could color all the white first and then just paint black over it. So right now I'm going to paint a nighttime sky. And when I do that, wow, look how cool that is. You can see my stars coming out in the nighttime sky. And I'm just going around my little black outline. And ta-da, there I have a sky. Now I'm going to take some black paint and I'm going to fill in the bottom. And look at that. It's like someone just turned the lights on. So super cool. Do you have to make a city to use this technique? No, this is just a fun thing. Dry brushing is a technique that sounds like you're using a dry brush, but it really isn't. The brush has water to start, but you can see I let some of the water soak into my paper towel, and then I'm going to spread the bristles out and just touch it to the wet paint. So it is wet paint, but it's just a touch of it. And because of this, it's a dry texture. So if you think there's too much paint, you can wipe it off on your paper towel and just drag your brush. And you just want a touch of paint. It's going to make a rough texture, great for things like grasses or even a tree. So I'm going to show you how to make a tree. I'm going to take a little water. I do have to add water to the paint if it hadn't been wet at all. So I add a little water and then I soak up the extra paint in the paper towel, spread out my bristles, and then drag the brush with just a drop of paint, right? So that doesn't have quite enough, but you can still see it's just a little bit. Get that nice rough tree bark texture. And I'll even take a touch of black and add like a little shadow to it. And you'll see it looks just like a tree, right? So I just want a tiny bit of texture. And look at that. I got myself a tree trunk. Blotting is a technique where you take a crumpled up piece of paper towel. You start by having a lot of paint on the paper. You can see I'm going to add a whole bunch of paint, but you got to do this part a little bit quickly while it's really wet. You take your crumpled piece of paper towel, and you just press it on the paint. And what's going to happen is it soaks up and leaves a little texture. The seventh technique I'm showing you is using regular markers like Mr. Sketch markers or Crayola. Just make sure they're not permanent. Regular markers, and just make a bunch of shapes. I'm going to make a diamond and a circle and a rectangle, and that just made it out of plain marker. And now I'm going to take plain water, and on this one, I'll put it on the inside, and you can see the marker bleeds with just the plain water. On this one, I'll put water on the outside of the shape. The inside stayed nice and clean, but the outside bleeds. We talked about bleeding earlier. And on this one, I'm just going to put water over the whole thing, and you can see the whole shape is kind of getting a little fuzzy and bleeding. And it's a really neat technique for making watercolors with markers. The last technique I'm going to share with you is using a Sharpie marker. Sharpies are permanent markers, and so they won't bleed like the markers we used earlier. So I'm just going to draw any old shape. I'm just making this up. You can draw anything you want with a Sharpie. So I'm making, I don't know, a square inside of a square with a little dome shape. And now I'm going to add paint, and the marker won't move because it's permanent marker. So I can take any color and just paint on top of it, and nothing happened to the marker, right? When I got the paper wet, the regular water-based markers, they bleed. Sharpies will not bleed, which is great because I can put colors inside of the shape or over the shape. It doesn't matter. I can even use like a little wet on wet technique inside the shape without touching the marker. So you can see I can put colors on top of colors. That's great, but it's not hurting my black line. See how it's bleeding inside the shape, but the black line stays. So you can see the difference between the marker bleeding and the Sharpie not bleeding.